Welcome to Grail Country. We're live streaming this morning. So, a friend of Grail Country, Dr. Michael Martin, posted something intriguing on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. Um, the X Machine, I suppose we can call it now. Uh, about, oh, here comes Sherry. Hey, Sherry, just on time. Hey, Sherry.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hi,
Glad
Michael.
you made it. So Michael posted something really intriguing about like having a new insight into Blake's poem Jerusalem, and I couldn't not talk to him about that because I love Michael and I love Blake, and how was I not going to want to talk about that? So, Michael, please share with us your fresh insight into the depths of Blake's Jerusalem.
Now, I don't want our listeners to confuse Jerusalem, the one I'm talking about, with the hymn Jerusalem, which was also written by William Blake, which actually, it starts with, and did those feet in ancient times, which was turned into a hymn early in the 20th century. And because that's actually the prologue to Blake's epic Milton, his illuminated epic Milton. Now, the Jerusalem I'm talking about is his last illuminated book, which is, and it's probably his masterpiece. I mean, this is one of the greatest poets ever. And to say it's the masterpiece of one of the greatest poets ever is saying something. And the full title is, as I will read you, I know it anyway, but Jerusalem, the emanation of the giant Albion. And what emanation means. Now, I think what happened, Blake, and now this is the weird thing, when you read this book, this poem, which he doesn't write in verse, and he could write in verse really well, but he took a different meter, he took a different approach, like Milton did with Paradise Lost. And he unfettered himself from the shackles of form, right? Which was his term. And he must have read Irenaeus' Against the Heresies, because there is so much Gnosticism in here. It's unbelievable. He's really describing a Gnostic kind of psychology, and this comes in with this idea of the emanation. So Jerusalem is the emanation of Albion, and Albion, you could say, is the spiritual form of England.
Okay.
And what happens? There's specters, which are like shadows. So Albion will have a specter, and each character in the poem has a specter and an emanation. And the emanation, one way you could think about the emanation is the Shakti, is the feminine counterpart of the male character, right? So Albion's emanation is Jerusalem, right? And so what happened? So the reason it's so Gnostic, because it kind of describes this really kind of intricate relationship between these different parts of the being, right? But the thing is, this is long before the Gnostic scriptures were discovered, and the only place he could have gotten it that I can think of is in Irenaeus' Against the Heresies, where Irenaeus gives kind of a thumbnail description of what the Gnostics, the Valentinian Gnostics in particular, believed, which is kind of amazing that William Blake, who was uneducated, was probably the best educated person in England at the time.
The other resonance for me, Michael, with the specters is the way that Tomberg talks about egregores as being the phantom of a thing.
Yes, like he talks about, like Tomberg talks about, the shadow of the Catholic Church is the fox.
Exactly. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Right. Yep.
And I can't remember. And the shadow of Russia is the bear, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Kind of the same idea. But Blake, I mean, it's just amazing. The thing I wrote on Twitter, this is about a month ago now, at least. See, yeah. I was getting ready. I was supposed to give a talk this month on magic, and so I was Magic and the Imagination. And so who do you go to when you want to talk about the imagination? William Blake's the first place to start, right? Or Coleridge. So I was going to the Romantics and seeing what they had to say about magic and imagination, which is super important. And Blake, it was, some of your listeners might know, I'm the editor of a journal called Jesus the Imagination, which I took directly from Blake. Because for Blake, the imagination is salvific, or at least it can be. Because, and for him, actually, in this book, the ultimate act of imagination is forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Because seriously, it takes a lot of imagination to do that, right? Well, let me just read you a little tiny thing here. I mean, it's a 100-page poem. It's a lot. You could never get through this. And you could give a graduate seminar on this for 15 weeks and still just be scratching the surface. But here's something he says at the beginning. Now, the book is broken into four parts. The first part has a preface. They each have a preface. The first part is to the public. And then he has to the Christians, to the deists, right? But at the end of his first introduction, here's what he says, right? Poetry fetters the human race. Nations are destroyed or flourish in proportion as their poetry, painting, and music are destroyed or flourish. The primeval state of man was wisdom, art, and science. So he throws all his cards on the table right at the beginning, right? Because for Blake, and it's interesting too. I mean, one of the things that happened to Blake before he was writing Jerusalem is he was arrested for sedition because there was a drunk soldier in his front garden of his house. It was the first time he lived outside of London in his life, and I don't know if he beat the guy's ass or what he did, but he upbraided him, and they said, "How could you do that to one of the king's soldiers?" And he must have said "F the king" or something. He did something, so he was put on trial. He was exonerated, but that was part of it. And so a lot of what he's going through in this poem, he's got this imaginary world he's invented, right? This mythology he's invented, but intruding into his mythology are all the people who he's been having trouble with, right? Who he felt were trying to oppress him or trying to make his life difficult in some way, including the soldier.
Quick question: do you think? Oh, there's an echo. Weird. Can you hear it? No, it's gone now. Okay. Do you think that the like you were just saying that these people showed up in his mythology, right? I had that same sense when I was reading Dante, that the people in Dante are, like real people in his life, right? That he met. And and I think that the poet has this like second sight, as George MacDonald would say, and he sees the specter, right? Mm-hmm. In the person. Like, so he's not necessarily addressing the person, but rather that specter that he identifies quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
And here's so in the first chapter of Jerusalem, there's Jesus speaks. So Jesus makes these appearances here, and it's really amazing. And the first time Jesus speaks is, "I am not a God far off. I am a brother and friend. Within your bosoms I reside, and you reside in me. Lo, we are one, forgiving all evil, not seeking recompense. Ye are my members, O ye sleepers of Beulah, land of shades." And the problem is with Albion in particular, is Albion rejects it. He can't accept that reality, right? Which is, and this is why I think this is the greatest poem ever, is because it really depicts, and I would particularly say Christian psychology. Mm. It's definitely human psychology, but in particular Christian psychology, in such a way that, I was talking to Marcus yesterday in the live stream, which I think was kicked off YouTube because we streamed part of a song by Opha Rex. And we got We got banged for
Oh no.
copyright infringement. I don't know. Why is it? We're on YouTube. It's on YouTube. It's like, how could that be? Whatever. But anyway, I was talking to Marcus yesterday about how people prefer to be miserable. They don't like joy. They say they do, but they don't.
No.
You know, people prefer misery. Yeah, misery is, I don't know. Misery loves comfort, or is more comfortable than joy. And that's one of the things that's going on through here is, why do you let, and this is why the key to the book is forgiveness, is because why do you do this to yourself and to others, right? You know what? And we do it. And Blake was you know, so such a passionate human being that he lays it all out here. And this is why people thought he was insane, because he creates this mythology, which is really hard to penetrate if you've tried to read Jerusalem. The first time you're like, what the hell is this? I don't get this. But then once you kind of acclimate yourself to that world, like with any other mythopoetic landscape, you know, then you, I see what he's doing here, which is why it's even more amazing. So let me just drop a few more. I mean, there's so many things in here, but let me drop a few more quotes from here. Right. And one of as probably a lot of your listeners might know, Blake had a problem with the Enlightenment and rationality, you know, and scientific materialism.
Yeah.
Right. And one of his great quotes, which I've probably used 100 times: abstract philosophy warring in enmity against imagination, which is the divine body of the Lord Jesus, blessed be forever. Right? So, and this is what I was thinking about in terms of imagination. Now, the thing is, the imagination is, we have no idea how incredibly powerful it is.
Mm-hmm.
But the agents of propaganda and, you know, government surveillance, etc., they know how powerful it is. So they try to manipulate the imaginations of people. And this is what interesting, and they do. I mean, so if you see, you know, so much of what we encounter in our day-to-day lives, especially after we saw this going through COVID, right, was kind of a magic spell that was put on people into their imaginations using slogans and images, right? Words and images, which is the same thing Blake is doing here. But Blake, and you could say the Romantic poets and Jordan MacDonald, Tolkien, they use the imagination for good. But which is, you know, let's call it white magic. Whereas propagandists and advertising executives or other, you know, love is love, other kinds of magical incantations or images. This is how it always works, usually through some kind of eros, is it's worked to bent to devious means. And so this is an interesting thing. As I was going through this project of writing this talk, I have to give pretty soon, that you know, what is the imagination, how is it used, and what can we do about it, right? And Blake was at the forefront of this. He was way ahead of the curve about the importance of this in face of what we could call an Ahrimanic scientific materialistic structure. So he was way up. I mean, you know, this was when he started the poem in 1805. I don't think he finished it till 1820. But he saw where it was going. This is why his unholy trinity is Bacon, Newton, and Locke, right? That's his unholy trinity. That's like, for him, it's the epitome of evil, right?
Yeah,
because
they
reject.
And it is. I'm just thinking about a quote from the Imagination essay from MacDonald, where he says that if the imagination isn't properly cultivated, she and he gives her a feminine form, she stays home to be sensual instead of going out to worship.
So this is really interesting, Sherry. Oh, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to say one more thing, and I think that ties into the idea of joy and misery, because joy, in order to experience joy, you have to pay every last farthing, as George MacDonald would say, right? That's what forgiveness requires of you. And misery doesn't. It allows you to keep your investment, let's say. Right? You don't have to pay it. It doesn't cost you anything. Misery doesn't cost, but joy
Misery is
costs.
miserly.
It totally is. Yeah. Probably comes from the same thing, like we think of misers as being miserable, right? So, yeah. And I think you're right to say that is like I don't know if you said it this way, but I was thinking of it as the axis of evil, right? When the imagination gets uncultivated or shut down through propaganda or whatever, because what it does is it keeps her home to be sensual. That's what it locks you in, right? And I think with Blake, and I haven't read the poem, unfortunately, but the images are like, the reason you can't nail it down is because it's wide open, right? Like it allows your imagination to soar. And so it goes everywhere, which is what he's doing. He's like letting the bird out of the cage kind of thing.
Right. And here's what he says. Now, probably my favorite quotes ever from any work of literature. And I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create.
Nice.
But in here, so I'm going to give an example of, so the specter. So probably one of the primary character, kind of like the character through the poem through whom we see action, is Los, Los. Sometimes nobody knows how pronounced it, Los or Los. But he works in a forge, right? And he's like the symbol for the creative genius, right? So he's Blake, basically. But here's what happens is Los is here working at the forge, right? He's creating. He's taking raw material and turning it into art, right? The city of art, Golganuza. But what happens is, because of anxiety, he splits, and his emanation comes, and splits from it. But then the specter splits, right? You can see, and when you're reading it, when you're really kind of doing a really kind of contemplative reading of this poem, and this is and I've read it about 15 times. You get this sense where it's happening inside of you as well. You can feel the anxiety is cranking up just by the power of the cadences of Blake's prose, and not prose, but poetry. And then you feel yourself rip, just as the specter or the emanation are torn away from the being, right? This fragmentation. But here's what he says with the specter. So the specters and the emanations, they all speak. They all take on. So it's like a split personality deal, right?
Yeah.
And here, after Los's specter splits from it, says, and then the specter answered, "Art thou not ashamed of those thy sins that thou callest thy children? Lo, the law of God commands that they be offered upon his altar. O cruelty and torment, for thine are also mine. I have kept silent hitherto concerning my chief delight." And then it goes a little bit farther. It continues accumulating to eternity. The joys of God advance, for he is righteous. Get this. He is not a being of pity and compassion. He cannot feel distress. He feeds on sacrifice and offering, delighting in cries and tears and clothed in holiness and solitude. But my griefs advance also, for ever and ever without end. Oh, that I could cease to be. Despair. I am despair created to be an example of horror and agony. This is Christian psychology, right? So which one is it? Which one is it? Is it the Jesus of the lost sheep? Is it the Jesus who says you're not far from the kingdom? Or is it this one?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, Michael, that you should bring that despair point. That really landed with me, because the conversation I just recorded with Roberto de la Naval and Mark Rusian, the Bulgakov translators who did Bulgakov's Spiritual Diary, one of the themes that they pick up on in the Spiritual Diary is the way that Bulgakov talks about despair. And despair is to me, based on some personal experiences that I've had, like, to me, like, despair is like the go-to motion of the demons, and they try to convince you that it's coming from God. That's the move.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, and so speaking of despair, I mean, I think what we saw going through COVID and all the lockdowns and stuff was pushing people into despair.
Yeah.
It was.
Yes, it really
I think
was.
That was by design. By design.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because and this goes back to Renaissance magic, medieval magic, it even goes to classical magic. If you can find people who are despairing or in pain or kind of psychologically suffering, those are the easiest people to manipulate, right?
I'm wondering
ideal subject.
Is there, Michael, because I haven't read the poem, is there any connection to like, I'm wondering, I think I would posit that fear is what cultivates despair, right? Like, if you are in a state of fear, a constant fear, then you can't live, right? Like, you're hiding, you're, all that kind of thing. You're locked down.
Right.
So I'm wondering, do you see any connection to that? Like, does it precede despair in the poem? Fear? Is there any fear in the poem that would be precede?
You broke up a little bit.
Is there any
all over the place? Yeah.
Okay.
But what he does is he illustrates how fear and anxiety create these splits in the psyche, right?
Right.
So it's not a good thing, but you recognize it. In fact, here's an example right here, still in chapter 1, where it's Los, and his specter divides, and Los in fury compels it to divide, to labor in the fire and the water and the earth and the air, to follow the daughters of Albion as the hound follows the scent of the wild inhabitant of the forest. A little bit farther, the specter of the living pursuing the emanations of the dead. Shuddering they flee, they hide in the druid temples in cold chastity, subdued by the specter of the living and terrified by undisguised desire. So part of what, now another thing he does, I mean, like I said, we could do 15 weeks of this. He anticipates Freud and Freud's critique of Christian sexuality, because he sees it, when you're feeling, and this is one of the problems that Blake was dealing with is, what do we do with eros and desire, and with often the feelings of guilt that accompany that, right? Or shame, right? And so he's trying to exercise that from the the Christian body, right? He's trying to get or at least show us that it's there. So, right? And he goes further. And the Lo says, "Though my specter is divided, as I am a living man, I must compel him to obey me wholly, that Initherman, which is his emanation, may not be lost, unless he should devour Initherman." So Initherman, who like the feminine counterpart, the emanation of Los, is this goes to Jungian psychology as well, right?
Yeah,
it's the integration of the anima, right?
Anima.
And so he's pointed that, but if you don't have an integrated anima, or if you don't have an integrated psyche, what happens is part of your personality becomes the specter, right? You become fearful and you act with whether it's with impunity or however. And I think I've seen this through my whole life with not only myself but others as well, where when you're afraid, and we see this in the church too, when the church is afraid, they start to crack down on the rules, right? And when people are afraid, they gotta resort to, okay, well, we should just, kind of a Rod Dreher move, right? With the kind of bunker mentality that some Christians embody or partake in, and you can see it with people. And sorry, converts. You see it with people who are attracted to traditional Catholicism or Orthodox, right? Where what they want to do is the world is a scary damn place.
Yeah.
And so they seek those places to hide from the world in a way. Some people, right? Maybe you do it partially, you don't do it all the way, right? But there's part of it, and I've been noticing this over the last 3 years, especially, where they kind of retreat from the world, and I think that's the attraction for the kind of
it's a
monastic
narrowing of
rule.
the it's a narrowing of the possibilities in order to create a more comfortable space to live.
Well, just it's a way
for
to
me,
deal with anxiety. It's a way to keep
right.
the anxiety out there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, it's limbic system. Like it's fight or flight, right? That's what it is. It's pretty much that.
So I wonder, like, to me, like the whole time that we've been talking along this vein, I keep thinking like that all of this is just kind of like a result of the pressures of what Tomberg refers to as horizontal evolution, right? Is like if you live in if your life is on the horizontal plane where survival of the fittest is what rules, these anxieties and fears are absolutely appropriate and natural if that is your only vision. So it's like you have to open yourself up to verticality and the cooperation for existence as within your possibility horizon before you can ever escape that, which is why imagination is key, because imagination is the faculty through which you see the world that might be and not the world that is, the world of brute fact, the world of the horizontal.
And that's what he's exactly describing, because he's just describing how these states of consciousness create different worlds that are perverted.
Yes.
Right? That are compromised and perverted.
So Michael,
but they have reality, right? It's not that they're not
real. Oh yeah. Our mutual friend, Sherry and I's mutual friend, Chad the Alcoholic, said something really, really brilliant and insightful recently.
That's his real last name?
No, he stays anonymous online. So he made this observation that consumerism outsources our imagination, which is actually a really, really important insight, and it's absolutely true. And you can show the way in which ties exactly into what you were saying about propaganda. So you can see how this faculty, which is really our true source of hope, becomes turned against us because it becomes captured and manipulated and outsourced.
Well, yeah, and this is actually something Rudolf Steiner was big on, right? About in training children. I mean, part of educating children is educating the imagination, and it is. I mean, it's inescapable. But how are you going to train that imagination? You know, is it going to be through a kind of white magic or through kind of black magic? So, in a Waldorf school, and those of you who don't know, I used to be a Waldorf teacher. The idea is to tell stories to children rather than show them a movie, or try to keep them off media as much as possible, because when you do that, the children build the images inside of their own souls, right? So if you're telling the story of even a Bible story of Adam and Eve, whatever, you know, there's one thing to tell the story. There's another thing because the children build the image inside of themselves. But there's another thing to show them a movie, right? Because those are pre-digested imagination, right? So it doesn't do anything for the imagination, right? And the same thing with dolls, for instance.
Yeah.
So in Waldorf, we encourage rag dolls, basically. And then, of course, unfortunately, because of the boutiqueification of Waldorf education, now you have these $150 rag dolls. But the idea is just to have like basically a piece of cloth with a head. In fact, my daughter had a corn cob she made into a baby when she was little.
Right.
Because the idea is to let the imagination do all the work, not
exactly right. Yeah,
and not the thing itself. It's supposed to be a tool for the imagination.
Yeah, this is actually like why I really, really hate virtual tabletops for role-playing games. Because it's like you're just like completely outsourcing your imagination and you're ruining the game.
But it doesn't cost you anything to do that. like when you were talking about the horizontal, I just, that Ouroboros image of the snake eating its own tail. So it's self-destructive, right? Like, this is the thing. And people just, I guess the tail's so far away that they just don't even notice that they're
right.
sawing the branch that they're sitting on.
So I don't know if people who are listening know this, but so if you look at Blake's job, he worked as an engraver. That was his day gig, right?
Mm-hmm.
They would make these poems at night. But he was pretty poor. He was pretty poor. But he was a visionary from a child. I mean, there was this great story where he saw a tree filled with angels when he was about 7 years old in the field, one of the fields near his house. And he was that open, and he didn't go to school because he went to school one day, and he came back and he said, "I'm not going back. That man looks like he should be hanged." And a few years later, he was.
Wow.
A few years later, that schoolmaster was hanged.
Wow.
So Blake and his family, and I think his parents too, went to a Swedenborgian church in London. This is way back in the day, right? When Swedenborg was still alive. And so early in his life, so that was, in Swedenborg is a very visionary kind of Christian, right?
Can you briefly summarize Swedenborgian theology for those who don't know?
Emanuel Swedenborg was ostensibly supposed to be the person with the highest IQ who ever lived. He was an engineer, but he started having visions, and he was in his 50s, I think, when he started having these visions about the eternal city and about the Christian reality. It's kind of like Burma in a way. Mm-hmm. And he was wildly popular. He was Swedish, but he lived in London for part of the time, which is where Blake probably met him when he was a kid. And he's got a lot of books. In fact, you might be able to find a Swedenborgian church in your neighborhood. I think there are 2 in Michigan. Oh. I knew a Swedenborgian priest when I was a gardener way back in the day. I ended up working for him. And he loaded me up. He gave me all these books. He gave me William Law, some other Burma, I think. So it was great to meet him. But I digress. But the thing is, so when Blake was around 30, he wrote one of his first illuminated books called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, right? Which was a kind of critique of Swedenborg, because I think Blake thought Swedenborg made it too white and black about the spiritual world. It's a little too fluffy, I think. And Blake was interested in, it's kind of like the classic story in Milton, right? In Paradise Lost. I mean, the most interesting character, Satan, right? And Blake was saying, you're missing the whole thing with the energy here. So in the Songs of Innocence and of Experience, right? He's got 2 poems. One is The Lamb. Mm. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? And the other one, he's got the tiger.
Yeah.
And then in the tiger, he says, there's a great line. Did he who make the lamb make thee?
Mm-hmm. I know. It's great.
It's true. Because the answer is yes. And It's both God made the lamb and the tiger, and so did William Blake, because he made those 2 poems, right?
Yeah.
But anyway.
I read that poem once when I was tripping. And I had a terrible experience. Yeah. I had this vision of vines coming off of the page and trying to attack. It was
run away.
You were trying to trip. You were trying to trip there, Nate.
We are not misbehaving here.
Sorry. Every time anybody mentions that poem, it's like I can't. That memory is just burned into my mind.
Okay. We're gonna pause for a second.
I felt like eyes staring back at me. I could feel I felt like the eyes of the tiger, like staring back at me, and the vines attempting to entangle me. That was the sensation I got.
Sorry, I didn't mean to initiate us.
It's okay. It's okay.
A little LSD flashback for Nate.
Yeah. But anyway, sorry where it's going. So Blake was kind of he's always kind of radical in the way he thought about things. But he was kind of, though he still loved Jesus, the imagination, he was super skeptical about the church and about even formal Christianity. But what happened when he went through all that trouble with the arrest and stuff, he had a kind of conversion, and he kind of came back home to, you would never say he's a Swedenborgian again, or you come to the Church of England or anything. But it was kind of a conversion experience, which is this poem is the result of his conversion, right? Where he comes back to Jesus. And there are, find it. So I have the illuminated version too.
Oh,
and
nice.
let me see if I can find the pictures of one of my favorite images from Jerusalem. No. I know it's in here someplace. I'll probably miss it, and then I'll find it as soon as we're done.
You know, like one of the coolest
Yeah.
gifts I ever got from my dad for Christmas is like one year he gave me this like this Blake illumination that he copied.
Oops.
My dad has some pretty good artistic ability.
So I'm just wondering, because I joined a little bit late. Like,
Here it is.
have we gotten to your?
There's
Okay.
the image. If you can see it.
Hold it up. There.
Yep.
You see where the figure is embracing
Standing before
Christ
the
on the
cross,
cross, right?
yeah.
Which I love that. But it looks triumphant. It doesn't look depressing, right?
Mhm.
And so he's embracing that. And this is what, it's what this whole poem is about, right? It's about redemption. And here's a quote just to accompany that, right? And this is from, who is saying this? Oh, human imagination, oh, divine body, I have crucified. I have turned my back upon thee into waste of moral law.
Mhm.
Right? Where, I mean, and isn't this the question? I mean, I think we're always talking about this in one way or another, is with the Christian mindset. I mean, how do you turn it? We talked earlier, right? Misery or joy. I mean, how do you embrace the joy of Christianity and not get bogged down in, like that scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail when God appears? Really. We're not worthy. Oh, stop groveling, right? Stop. Every time I appear with someone, I'm sorry for this. I didn't mean to do that. I'm sick of it, right? And how can, and that's Blake is asking the same question, right?
Mhm.
Can't we make it happier?
This is. I was listening.
Is this not reason for joy?
Mhm.
Right.
I was listening to a
Flagellation.
conversation with Rupert Sheldrake and Bernardo Kastrup yesterday, and Bernardo Kastrup referred back to Jung's interpretation of the Book of Job, and it was so much like what you were just describing. Where I mean, I haven't read Jung's book, but the way Bernardo was talking about it, he said, Jung shows how God takes Job to task and says, pull up your pants, and yells at him, and and I don't see that at all. I see that whole interaction with God and Job as a father to his child, where if you tone it all down, you have a very loving, caring, like God says to Job, you speak and I will listen. I want to hear what you have to say. And Job says, I have nothing to say. And God says, okay, then I'll talk. Right. So that, like, it's a dialogue. And we want to superimpose this, like we talked about with Rafe, Nate, the Sky Daddy, onto all the stuff that we read.
Right.
And so Jung takes this whole tack to it. He decides that the Old Testament God is this Sky Daddy, and Jesus transforms him into something else.
Yeah.
And I don't see that. I see Jesus.
But he is reacting, right? I think Jung, to be fair to Jung, he's reacting to a way in which the Book of Job was definitely taught when he was being formed. So
Yeah.
although he may be missing the true depths of the
Well,
book
I
of
mean,
Job,
I just think, couldn't he have had a little more insight than that? Like that, to me, that's like,
yeah,
But
I don't know if
it's
I think
unfortunate.
yeah, I don't
Anyway.
know if he tried because he was angry because of what he'd been presented as a younger
Yeah,
person.
totally. Yeah.
But I think people don't. I just, in fact, those essay I was writing about imagination and magic, I quoted Jung from something he wrote, which is kind of one of his more obscure writings, where it was after the rise of Hitler that he wrote it, right? And what happened, right? So the thing is, they were dealing with in his generation almost an unimaginable kind of
Yeah.
civilizational collapse.
Mm-hmm.
You could say, there's an argument to be made. I wouldn't make it, but you could say the collapse of the West, which we're still witnessing now, is really a failure of Christianity.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And a failure of imagination.
He saw it coming 200 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And here's one of the things he writes in the preface to. He writes actually a little thing in verse, to the second book, which is dedicated to the Jews. And he says, he withered up the human form by laws of sacrifice for sin, till it became a mortal worm, but translucent all within. The divine vision still was seen, still was the human form divine, weeping and weak in mortal clay. Oh, Jesus, still the form was mine, right? And so Blake actually saw a very similar thing to what Jung was talking about the God of the Old Testament as not being the God represented by Jesus. And this is not new. This is a Gnostic insight from way back in the day, right? That, and I don't partake in this, but that creation itself was evil because it's the product of the demiurge, right?
Yeah. Totally.
That it was created as a trap, and this is what the Gnostics thought. And Blake, I mean, he would never say he was a Gnostic, but there are certainly Gnostic elements to the way he thinks.
But in some ways, Gnosticism. There's a way in which Gnosticism has to be a part of Christianity, and here's why: because it requires Christianity for you to see the stark contrast. Like, it's only through the light of Christ that you can actually see how much things are not the way they ought to be. And that makes it so that there's a way in which they kind of necessarily go hand in hand. The problem with Gnosticism is that it's just like an impulse too far in a particular direction.
Right. And another. Now, this is actually from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, where he's got the Proverbs of Hell. And I think one of them is very insightful. Prisons are built with the stones of law, and bricks, and brothels with the bricks of religion. Right? Which is, I think, a unique insight. Mm-hmm. Because, and that's what the specter is, right? So out of a fault will, a neurotic morality, right? You create the thing, or another thing Blake says over and over in Jerusalem is they became what they beheld, right? They became what they beheld. So you can see with, people, Christians or otherwise, who are obsessing about, sexual sin or whatever. They became what they beheld, because that's your imagination.
Yeah, well, this is that.
It's inhabiting your imagination. You have no idea how powerful this is, right?
Right.
Yeah, John Vervaeke talks about it in terms of reciprocal narrowing, right? Like if you focus on something in particular, and I mean, before I listened to John Vervaeke or anybody actually, I noticed that the people who focused on something, and like in particular, it was someone I knew who was focused on trying to retrieve an apology from someone for something they did to them.
Right.
And the person who should have apologized was living like their life was comprised of bitterness and anger, right, and unforgiveness, and so they perpetrated something on somebody else, and then that person, in order to get the apology, had to remain in that place. They had to be angry and bitter, right?
Yep.
They couldn't let it go, and then they became just like the person that they disliked.
Okay, so
And I was
Sherry,
just like, oh my gosh, the only way out of it is just to let it go, right?
that's
And
really
forgive.
good, Sherry. Well, here's the thing. I almost said this earlier. I want to get back to the connection between forgiveness and imagination, because I actually I kind of like have a few threads that I want to tie together to suggest how that is the case. And the threads I want to tie together come from Barfield and Coleridge, and what they say about the imagination and as the function of the ability to say I am that, and then what Tomberg says,
Right.
that ultimately what imagination is its capacity to become the other. Then when we start thinking about imagination's like ultimate function in that way, then we can see how imagination is necessarily tied to forgiveness, because if you're able to see how a person did what they did, even if it was wrong, if you're able to put yourself into their shoes to understand, like, how if you had been subjected under to the same circumstances, perhaps you would have done the same thing, then it's much easier to find your way to forgiving the person. So imagination is absolutely tied to forgiveness.
Well,
Right.
oh, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
No, good. So one of the things, so Blake here in still book 2, and he starts this section with these words: "Then Los grew furious, raging," and you get this cadence he has here, just like, oh damn, right? I'm getting carried away. And one of the things he says here, this is Los speaking: "It's a pretense of art to destroy art, a pretense of liberty to destroy liberty, a pretense of religion to destroy religion." And he keeps going. And then, "Instead of Albion's lovely in mountains and the curtains of Jerusalem, I see a cave, a rock, a tree deadly and poisonous, unimaginative. Instead of mutual forgiveness, the minute particulars. I see bits of bitumen ever burning, artificial riches of the Canaanite like lakes of liquid lead instead of heavenly chapels built by our dear Lord. I see worlds crusted with snows and ice. I see a wicker idol woven round Jerusalem's children." And then he goes on: "I will not endure this thing. I alone withstand to death this outrage." Right? So, and he knows that what they became what they beheld. And that we see these things, right? And that they insert themselves into our imaginations, and by repeated exposure to them, they compromise us. And this is his critique, is that, guess what? It's not just the world that does that. The church does this as well. It's a mechanism of control. So he's really kind of a prophet of freedom in this way.
Yeah.
Have you thought about the word behold? Like, I've thought about it. Michael Martin, Martin Shaw, close. Martin Shaw mentioned the word to me at one point, and there's something really interesting about that word in my mind. Like, I don't know if this is an etymological thing or anything, but just the way my imagination works. I think of be and holding. Be as existence or essence, right? The essence of a thing. And holding as a maternal act, right? Cradling. And so when you behold something, you love it into existence, in a sense, like a mother would a baby, right? And it doesn't necessarily, like, you might be holding a monster, right? And you may be loving that thing into existence, right?
Behold, I make all things new.
Yeah, and so
has extra resonances.
And this gets back to my whole thing with the face and face to face and turning and repentance and all this stuff, because beholding, you have to turn and face something, right? You have to behold it. and beholding, I mean, it's a word that challenges you, or should challenge you, because it has to do with existence, right? The very essence of the thing. So if you are truly beholding something, then you are looking beyond what you see, right? You're looking beyond its physical appearances, and you're seeing into something that is greater than what it appears to be, I think. And it can be, either.
Are you suggesting that behold is a Sophianic word? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Beholding.
I'm gonna go with that. I'll go with that.
Yeah.
By the way, you can confuse me with Martin Shaw anytime, and I won't be offended.
Well, it was Michael Martin Shaw.
Yeah,
they all ran together in my mind. But Michael needs a bigger beard.
So here's another quote. Let me drop some more wisdom on y'all.
Okay.
Talking about the specter. Description. The specter is the reasoning power in man, and when separated from imagination and closing itself as in steel in a ratio of the things of memory, it thence frames laws and moralities to destroy imagination, the divine body, by martyrdoms and wars. Teach me, O Holy Spirit, the testimony of Jesus. Let me comprehend wondrous things out of the divine law. I behold Babylon in the opening street of London. I behold Jerusalem in ruins, wandering about from house to house. This I behold, the shudderings of death attend my steps. I walk up and down, in 6,000 years their events are present before me. Right? I mean, it's about perception.
Perception, yeah.
And this is the same poet, right? Who did those feet in ancient time, running the mountains green, right? You can either see that, or you can see this.
Yeah. Is it time to let Luke in the stream so he can talk about Mosaic vision?
Well, there's I also listened to this week. I listened to a UBC lecture by Owen Barfield from 1978 on the evolution of consciousness, and he makes the case for perception preceding, which is, I would say that he's kind of coming at it from a Steiner point of view, with perception being intuition, being the
right. So for it's definitely perception. Like our spiritual senses are part of the perception. The problem is that when we bracket them out, then we get a distorted perception. But
he was just talking about evolution of consciousness and history and knowledge and perception, and he, in his opinion, perception preceded all of everything else, right?
Right.
And yeah, I can't say more than that, but it was a really good lecture.
Well, I mean, it has to, right? Because there without perception, then consciousness can have no content at all.
Well, he doesn't think consciousness is a. He thinks we live within it, and I actually think that that's what imagination is. Like the way George MacDonald talks about imagination is that imagination is that the divine imagination is that where we live and move and have our being, right? Because everything around us came from it. Like all of creation came from God's imagination. And that's why George says, all our imagination does is light the lamp within the form, right? It illuminates the meaning that God already put in it. So we actually live in the divine imagination,
which is illumination, or which is illumination, which is perception. Which
well,
is why
I don't know if it is those things, but it requires those things in order to perceive it, right? Like to see it, and
it's the prerequisite for anything else.
Yeah, and if you don't cultivate those things, then you're not going to see it, right? Then you're just a flat materialist.
It's formless darkness. It that's the alternative. Right. It's either the only alternative is
where there's
darkness.
Wailing and gnashing of teeth.
Yes.
Right? Despair.
Yeah.
That's what that is.
Well, here, and Blake points to that here at the beginning of the preface to book 4, 4th chapter, he gives this great little. I've probably said it a million times. I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. So it's like the key, right? But here's a little bit farther down, just a few lines down. He says, all the tortures of repentance are tortures of self-reproach on account of our leaving the divine harvest to the enemy. The struggles of entanglement with incoherent roots. And here's the kicker. I know of no other Christianity and of no other gospel, the liberty of both body and mind to exercise the divine arts of imagination.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
Right? It's the everlasting gospel.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the thing. Now, people, when they resist this, so people will go, feel response. I don't know about that. And that's the whole thing, right? Because that response is, that's your fear talking.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that most religious institutions have completely shut down the imagination. It's an evil thing. Yeah.
And a lot of people try, good for good reason. Self-hate leads a lot of people to Christ. But it's not supposed to be a perpetual state, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awkward silence.
We gotta.
No, it's true. You're right. Like that just hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, and I really like the way that you tie it to gospel, and that resonates with me because this is something I was just thinking about. Because actually, we got a comment, I think yesterday, on one of our older videos from our series on ML Bach's Apocalypse of John, and the comment was, "Isn't the first love the love of the gospel?" And my response to that poster was, it depends on what you mean. Because if you mean what Michael just said, when you say gospel, that's right.
But well, it's interesting because like in the Orthodox tradition, the gospel lays on the altar, right? The gospel is the person of Christ. It's the story told, right? Of his life. And I think it was Addison Hodges Hart did a series on his Substack on the Gospels, and he showed how imagination was used in the writing of the Gospels, because there are seemingly contradictory portions of it, right? But it's also a technique in holding up these coincidence of opposites in order to create a tension, in order to reveal like a fuller image of what it is you're trying to talk about with symbolic language, right? I think he used the example of Christ coming into Jerusalem in the book of Mark. It's been a while since I read it, and I've forgotten now. Something about the colt and the donkey, or something like that. And what those two images actually represent, and some people would say, "Oh, that he made a mistake." And then I realized that, okay, so this is also even the Gospels, which we think of as narratives, right, as biographies, are poetic in that sense, because they're using symbolism and what do you call that? Dialectic? Is that what it's called?
Well, Jesus speaks in parables throughout the Gospels.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the writers themselves.
Right.
The people who wrote them were writing them in a poetic way, like in an imaginative way, right? They were weaving these golden threads throughout.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So let me. Toward the end of Jerusalem, the 4th book, when it kind of comes to a resolution, Albion replied, so Albion's awake now. Albion's been asleep for most of the book because he's ensnared in materialism. Albion replied, cannot man exist without mysterious offering of self for another? Is this friendship and brotherhood I see in the likeness and similitude of Lois, my friend? And Jesus said, wouldst thou love one who never died for thee, or ever die for one who had not died for thee? And if God dieth not for man, and giveth not himself eternally for man, man could not exist. For man is love, as God is love. Every kindness to another is a little death. In the divine image, nor can man exist but by brotherhood. So saying, the cloud overshadowing divided them asunder. Albion stood in terror, not for himself, but for his friend. Divine in self was lost in the contemplation of faith, and wonder at the divine mercy, at Los' sublime honor. And then, do I sleep amidst danger to friends? O my cities and countries, do you sleep? Rouse up, eternal death is abroad. So Albion spoke, and threw himself into the furnaces of affliction.
Mm.
All was a vision, all a dream. The furnaces became fountains of living waters, flowing from the divine, the humanity divine. And all the cities of Albion arose from their slumbers, and all the sons and daughters of Albion on soft clouds waking from sleep. Soon all around remote the heavens burnt with flaming fires, and Urizen and Luva and Tarmus and Urthona arose into Albion's bosom. Then Albion stood before Jesus in the clouds of heaven, fourfold among the visions of God in eternity.
Beautiful.
Right? So even up to the end, Albion is still afflicted, but then when he throws himself into the furnace, it becomes living water.
Yeah.
Right? Which is pretty. Whoa, that's heavy, yo! Right?
Yeah.
Well, that's like when Jess and I were going through the book of Job, we noted that when Job said, I'm going to put my hand before my mouth, and he's talking to God, because God says, have you got anything else to say? Like, would you like to say some more? I'm listening. And Job says, no, I'm going to put my hand in front of my mouth because I have spoken of things too wonderful for me. And he's in this absolute like peace that passes understanding position, right? And yet he's still covered in sores. He's still lost everything. He's still covered in dust and ashes, right? And it's in the midst of that he sees God, which I think is really poignant.
Right.
Right. Which is what Blake
did illustrations.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Blake did a series of illustrations for the book of Job.
I know. I have the book. Yeah.
And I think that line from the tiger is a procreation from Job when he says, and when the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee?
Yeah, I love that. I love it. And that's why I keep pushing back on this. Like, we had a conversation with Rafe Kelly recently, and I pushed back on the idea of trying to avoid bullshit, because I'm like, well, hang on now. Like, we got to have this kind of conflict, or not conflict, but what's, like this, we've got to come up against something in order to find out who we truly are. And like Blake says, God made the tiger, right? He made the tiger.
Right. This is actually tied to, Sherry, like why we remember most fondly the leaders who gave us a vision. That's why the vision thing, as some cynical types want to call it, that's why it matters. And that's why we look back on those people who presented us with it fondly, because we need that.
Yeah. And most of them were pretty tortured, to be honest with you.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, they were in that furnace that Blake talks about, right? Because when you see everything, like, this is why you can't see God's face and live, right? Mm-hmm. Because it will make your brain explode. Like, it will torture you, because that's why Job says, I've spoken of things too wonderful for me. Like, how did I dare? Right? How did I dare?
Yeah, and I think so for me, it's I don't think Blake is trying to tell people how to avoid all that stuff.
No.
I think he's describing how it works psychologically. Yeah. But the thing is, people, people are addicted to misery.
Mm-hmm.
People are addicted to misery, and they just don't want to let go. And even when they're in the bosom of Jesus, they still want to be miserable. In fact, Marcus actually read it at the end of our our live stream yesterday before YouTube kicked us off. He read George Herbert's poem Love 3, the one that inspired Simone Weil, right? Where in that poem, the speaker, it takes place in heaven, and heaven is basically a kitchen where Jesus is going to feed you, right? You're going to sit down and you're like, but I don't deserve to be here. Well, why do you think who do you think paid the cost, right? But I still don't. Sit down. Sit down. We're gonna taste something. I'm gonna feed you, right? It's a Eucharistic image. And I think Herbert and Blake are also, they're aware of this kind of Christian psychology, which, as one of our people, I think it was Eric, was talking about how those who suffer come to God. Yeah, but once you get there, you're supposed to knock it off with the suffering, right? You're supposed to stop. You know, why can't it be joyful? And this is what I notice in my Amish neighbors. Those are some happy people.
Yeah.
They're joyful people, right? I'm sure they also probably contend with anxiety and things like this. You know, upon occasion, it's human nature, right? But they seem to dwell in joy much more than most of the Christians I know.
You can see this in the way Kierkegaard talks about the night of faith too, right? Because like the night of faith, it's not like but the night of faith doesn't get everything that the night of faith like imagines that he might get, but he is content with what he has. So
you know, this thing
he's a poor man who dreams of his wife cooking this sumptuous is going to have a sumptuous meal like prepared for him when he arrives home, and when he arrives home, that's not what's actually presented to him, but he's content with what's given to him and enjoys it.
I keep having this image from the story that George MacDonald wrote called The Castle, where the sister, so there's an older sister and a brother, and then all the other kids. And the older brother the kids decide to just run rampant in the castle, and they tie up the older brother and put him in a dungeon kind of thing. Anyways, he's redeemed from that, and he's standing there with the sister, and she's looking out the window. Well, first of all, I think he says to her, go look and tell me what you see. And she sees the heavens meeting the tops of the mountains. And then she thinks, because their father is somewhere and he's supposed to be coming back, and she thinks she sees the father coming out from between, like right at that meeting point, right? And then and she kind of gasps, and then she falls on her knees, and then she looks, and all she sees is the brother, right? Who represents Christ, right? The older brother. And then everything comes clear to her, right? So there's the brother and the father, right? All together. And I don't know why I'm talking about that, but something you guys, it's just been, that image has just been going around and around in this whole conversation, because sometimes we spend all our time waiting for this thing to come, I think perhaps we forget to see that it's already here. Right? It's already
now. That's right. This is why I think this is actually I think, was it in the context? You also said something recently about Derrida and the delay of the Messiah. Exactly, I don't know if it was in that same, but that's but this is what that's exactly what Derrida can't see, is that you're supposed to be presencing. You're supposed to be presencing now.
Oh, he does. I think he does.
You think he does?
I think Derrida does do that. Yeah. Okay. And because in his later writing, he's more of a negative theologian than a deconstructed philosopher.
Gotcha.
And when he talks about religion without religion, right? This is one of the things he talks about, right? And the non-arrival of the Messiah. He's just describing how people, you might say you want the Messiah to come, but you don't really want the Messiah to come. You know what I mean? You don't want. You gotta. Let's face it. You're happy, busy, being miserable. Or with the stuff you have, right?
Take care. Have a safe
We
trip.
interrupt our broadcast for a hug.
That's my little girl's going back to college. Mom's driving
Oh,
her.
nice.
My little girl went last week. No, earlier this week. Where was? With Derrida, right?
Yeah.
And I think both of them are just they're Blake and Derrida are descriptive, not offering an explanation. I mean,
right.
About explaining.
Well, and I would say when you get to that point that you're getting to the very heart of Christianity, which is why my response to John Vervaeke and the religion that was not a religion, I think he's sort of has reframed that these days. But when he was talking about the religion that is not a religion, my response to that is that's what Christianity is. If you have gone deeply enough into Christianity and understand Christianity, you will understand that Christianity is already the religion that is not a religion.
Which is the weird thing about it, right? Because
yeah, exactly.
Well, because especially what I as I have been kind of ripping on lately for the last couple of years, is that's why people, and this Blake is not doing this, but people almost universally, and it's easy to do, is confuse that one guy, Steve Skocek, is that his name? He was the guy who was church militant, but then he left the church, and now he does kind of an agnostic.
Oh, okay.
And I had a little interaction with him on X the other day, because my position is that the problem, that faces Christians right now, if Christianity is going to grow up, is to stop confusing the church with the institution or with the guys running things. And you can't do that. I mean, if you ask somebody to define the church, and this is, I'm sorry, this is a kind of deconstructive move, but you realize how quickly that falls apart under interrogation.
Right.
Well, it's the magisterium. Well, where's that come from? Well, wait,
the one true church is not something that you can point to in any moment of temporality. Because the one true church is an eschatological realization.
Right. And I think I had this conversation with Paul Vanderklay when we were in DC last year. But it falls apart because everybody thinks they're part of the church. But then you ask them to define it. Well, it's the guys running things. No. Or it's the institution.
Yeah. And so, in my opinion, most people who fall away from the faith, from their church, evangelicals, Catholics, Orthodox, whatever, their faith was not in God or Christ. It was in the institution, and it disappointed them, and it always will.
Yeah. And this was, certainly not a Protestant, but I got protests by everything. But in the Reformation, that was, in the Geneva Bible, I think it's the Geneva Bible, there's a frontispiece which has the invisible church. That was the idea. They were trying to get back to that. Of course, immediately they became institutionalized, right?
And exclusive, and overly exclusive. Like, just think about it.
Calvin, yeah.
Just went,
I mean, crazy. It's inescapable in one way, but that's the thing that Blake is trying to draw our attention to, right? That prisons are built with the stones of law and brothels with the bricks of religion.
Well, what always fascinated me about Blake, Michael, and maybe you can, because I really don't know a lot about him and I haven't read a lot of his stuff. But one of the things I've noticed is that he takes very seriously the body, and not just in his writings, but in his art. Like, he really he draws in amazing bodies, right? Like, really grand and dignified and regal, and as a masterpiece of creation feeling.
And he's actually drawing on Michelangelo.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So, like, his inspiration. Yeah.
Is there anything that pops into your head right at the moment? Because I have this thing about bodies that really stands out to you about what does Blake say, like, with words about the body? Does he have anything to say about that, or does he just image it?
Yeah. There's so many things. Let me see if I can find a quote for you. I think I was just looking at one.
Okay, because I would just assume that the body is not it's multifaceted for him, right? Like it would be the invisible church. This is why I'm asking the question. It would be the body of Christ. It would be our bodies. It would be the body of our Lord. It would be all, it would entail suffering, which is why I find it so fascinating, because it is the vehicle through which we suffer.
Well,
right.
Well, a lot of what I think, in a way, oversimplifying, what Blake is exploring in his discussions of the body and sin, it's kind of like it's almost like a long ass footnote to Genesis when God says, "Who told you were naked?"
Oh,
right.
Cool.
I think that's what he's doing. And so here's an example. Is probably not the. But what happens is because of that, you get it. And you see this also. Blake's favorite poet was John Milton in Paradise Lost, right? In Paradise Lost, that's, Adam and Eve actually have sex before the fall. I know it's going to shock some people. But what happens is after the fall, they look at each other as objects in Paradise Lost. And here's what Blake says in Book 3. Imputing sin and righteousness to individuals, Rahab sat deep within him hid. His feminine power unrevealed, brooding abstract philosophy to destroy imagination, the divine humanity. A threefold wonder, feminine, most beautiful, threefold, each within the other. Right? So there is some discussion of whether or not Blake was a proponent of free love in his real life, in life.
Yeah, I've heard about
But
that.
on the other hand, the other part of it is that no, he loved his wife. It's true. He loved his wife so much he would never do that to her. But he liked the idea, right? And the reason he liked the idea is because he was trying to work out what the role of shame in the human psyche. And I think Wilhelm Reich was later doing the same thing. I don't think Reich came to the exact right conclusions either. But I think they were trying, and Freud was too. We avoid this reality, or this whatever it is, and as a result, various neuroses or psychoses arise, right? So how do we avoid that, right?
I think
I don't think there's
like for me personally, I think that the idea of our body being a temple is one way to bring yourself back to the imagination not staying home to be sensual, right? And but going out to worship, because a lot of I think it was even the early Anabaptists, they practiced free love too, and I think that is, and I mean we saw that more recently in the 60s, right? When people have a sense of freedom and love, that's the first thing that they do is just practice this idea of free love, because it's like a way to physically manifest what's going on in your head, right? But if you think of your body as a temple, then then that puts it. I think that should at least impact you in a way that puts all of it into a better perspective.
Well, and I think there's an answer. I mean, the one answer to this that is in the Bible is the Song of Solomon, right?
Right.
Which I always think of as the Judeo-Christian Kama Sutra, because there is no other. This is what I tried to puzzle out in my chapter on marriage in Sophia in Exile. Is, I mean, and we don't see a healthy. Very often, well, put it this way: it's not that we don't see a healthy example of Christian sexuality anywhere, but it's so often compromised, usually by the guys in charge, right? Who, especially in the Orthodox and Catholic world, the guys calling the shots are typically celibate bishops and priests. So what do you know? Is this theory that you're giving me this advice? Is this theoretical, right?
Right.
and I think and that's one thing that Swedenborg was trying to deal with. You see this in D.H. Lawrence, you see it in Reich, you see it in Kenneth Rexroth. They're all trying to figure this one out, and I'm with them, right? I'm trying to figure it out too. But and I think they've all concluded, not that I we have an answer, but what we have is wrong. What we have is somehow inefficient or incomplete, right? Especially, if you look at in Orthodoxy and Catholicism, believe it or not, there's a prohibition about married priests or deacons having relations with their wives the night before liturgy, right?
Yeah.
Where on the other hand, in the Jewish tradition, especially in Hasidim and in the Kabbalah, if a man and his wife join in sexual congress the night before the Sabbath, it prefigures the reunification of God with his Shekinah. So which one is a more healthy picture, right?
I know. I've thought about
well, not just the night before the Sabbath, but like
on the Sabbath.
Yeah, the Sabbath itself. That's actually a mitzvah.
Yeah,
to engage
which
in
is
relations on the
which
Sabbath.
I have decided is the reason that Jewish men love the Sabbath.
And Christian men with Jewish wives.
No wonder they love it.
Oh, you want to have people over for Sabbath dinner? You want me to cancel my game night? Yeah,
Sabbath dinner.
sure. No problem, honey.
Oh.
Well, just face it. I mean, the Bible begins with a wedding and ends with one, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, like in
the
that
New
conversation
Jerusalem
with
sound
Ray
like a
Kelly,
bride adorned for her husband. What's the
he said,
subtext there?
I know, like in the conversation with Ray, he said something.
Really.
Oh, we got an echo.
I mean, you go through the history of Christian mysticism, and it's so erotic. Much of it, not all of it, but so much of it speaks in the language of love, right? Of intimacy, right? The Song of Songs, I think, is the most beautiful poem ever written.
Yeah.
Right? Can't we just be healthy? Is it required to be neurotic? I just need to know.
Well, the thing is, I think this is part of the becoming is finding that middle, like I said, like a lot of these people that experienced freedom in Christ went to free love, right? And I'm trying to think of which reformer it was, but I read some history about how they ended up polygamous or polyamorous or something. Mostly, I think polygamous, because that's kind of where it ends up. The power struggle, right? Where one guy's got like 17 wives, and then they barred all the young men from the city, and just like, and it just turns into a gong show, and so. And then they have the other end of the pendulum where everybody's just celibate and beating themselves to death, right? Because their bodies are not conforming to their their ideologies, and so it's like that's why I said earlier, like there's something about the idea of the body being the temple, and I haven't given it a whole lot of thought, but that should bring you into that place where both of those things can be reconciled properly, right?
Well, referring it to as a temple is a reminder that it's sacred space, right? So that's why, and it's not, you don't want to do profane things with a space that is sacred, and so that I think that's like that puts you on the pathway to thinking about this in a more productive way. And then it gets really complex though, because then it's the question is like, so let's just leave it at that for now.
But here's one thing
before I open a giant can of worms.
Blake says, and this is Los speaking, or about to speak, for the male is a furnace of beryl, the female is a golden loom. Los cries, no individual ought to appropriate to himself or to his emanation any of the universal characteristics of David or of Eve, of the woman or of the Lord, or of Reuben or of Benjamin, or Joseph or Judah or Levi. Those who dare appropriate to themselves universal attributes are the blasphemous selfhoods and must be broken asunder. A vegetated Christ and a virgin Eve are the hermaphroditic blasphemy. By his maternal birth, he is that evil one, and his maternal humanity must be put off eternally, lest the sexual generation swallow up regeneration. Come, Lord Jesus, take on thee the satanic body of holiness. So Lost cried. And a little bit later he says, when the individual appropriates universality, he divides into male and female. And when the male and female appropriate individuality, they become an eternal death, hermaphroditic worshippers of a God of cruelty and law.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I mean, I can think of a lot of things in that, but I think, when he talked about the hermaphroditic worshippers of a God of cruelty and law, I mean, just think of the trans thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just that's what's become. It's become a hermaphroditic worshippers of a God of cruelty and law.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how it's morphed into this morality, like this weird morality has emerged out of it, right?
It's Antichrist.
Yeah,
Or it's not the Antichrist, but it's a outgrowth of the Antichrist, right?
Like a little
mocking of God.
horn.
It's a mocking of
Is
creation.
it like a little horn, Michael?
Pardon?
Like a little horn?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, specifically, it's a morality that seeks to make that which is sacred for common use, which is exactly what Sodom does.
It's porn.
Yeah, well, I just find it so interesting that suddenly you're locked into this moral, either you're a good person or you're a bad person if on the basis of acceptance of this thing, right? And everything becomes a moral outcry or a moral outrage about it. Like it's all wrapped up in morality. It's
a priesthood. It's a secular priesthood.
Exactly right.
Right. Yeah. It's the what Nathaniel Hawthorne, right? It's the Scarlet Letter.
Yeah.
Right. It's shame culture. And
people have
eradicate.
People have forgotten, like Blake, like you started out saying, how Blake sees these people in his everyday life, but he's talking about the specter, right? The thing that has divided itself away from them. And I think people today, they don't know how to accept the description, which is what Blake is doing, describing, of the specter apart from the actual person, right? So if you talk about the specter, you're talking about the person, and that's a bad thing, right? And that's not the same thing.
No.
Right. In his answer, I mean, we probably getting close to wrapping up. He says, go tell them that the worship of God is honoring his gifts in other men and loving the greatest men best, each according to his genius, which is the Holy Ghost in man. There is no other God than that God who is the intellectual fountain of humanity. Mm-hmm. He who envies or calumniates, which is murder and cruelty, murders the Holy One. Go tell them this and overthrow their cup, their bread, their altar table, their incense and their oath, their marriage and their baptism, their burial and consecration. I have tried to make friends by corporeal gifts, but have only made enemies. I have never made friends but by spiritual gifts, by severe contentions of friendship in the burning fire of thought. He who would see the divinity must see him and his children, one first, in friendship and love. Then a divine family, and in the midst Jesus will appear. So he who wishes to see a vision, a perfect whole, must see it in its minute particulars.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautiful.
That's how. Right?
That's it.
Yeah, that's it, and that's like, which brings us right back to the scandal of the particularity of Christ.
The scandal?
Yeah, that's because we want to abstract and universalize, and we're scandalized by the particular.
Oh, we are, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but if anybody wants to hear an incredible conversation about the particular and the whole and how they correspond and division without or distinction without division, you should watch the Rupert Sheldrake Bernardo Kastrup conversation. Came out on Rupert Sheldrake.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that one.
It's a really good.
I haven't had a chance to watch it, but
and it was so interesting because what I found most interesting about it was that they found a ton of common ground, but didn't realize it. Well, Rupert did, But Bernardo didn't realize it because they weren't using the same language. And so Rupert just kind of helped him to understand that they're talking about the same thing.
I love Rupert. Rupert's great.
But yeah,
we had one comment that I wanted to address briefly.
I wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, me too. Good. There's a lot of talk here, but what does this mean for practice? The first thing I want to say to this is that how did God create the world? Through speech.
Good one.
All right, but go ahead, Sherry.
Well, you can't practice what you don't know. It's basically the same thing, right? Like you have to come to an understanding in order to put anything into your body. Like right. what it's as on earth as it is in heaven. Okay, that which is above should correspond to that which is below, right? So and this is our highest thing. It's our head. It's the highest thing in our body. It's our heaven. And so nobody acts solely, like they don't just go out and act. They act because they have a thought.
Right. Well, this actually ties to what I was saying earlier about visionary leaders, right? So a lot of times people will criticize like visionary leaders as being impractical, and yet they're the ones we really remember and the ones we really honor. And even if what they wanted wasn't accomplished in their lifetimes, they move the needle of history in a direction towards something better through their actions and their words.
And the other thing I would also just briefly say was yesterday in the conversation with Rupert Sheldrake and Bernardo, he was trying to explain the Trinity to Bernardo, and he said, the metaphor of the Trinity is the metaphor of speech. And I was just like, oh, somebody said it. Because I always had that idea that this is what the Trinity is, right? It's the heaven, right? It's the breath, and then it's the body. This is the Trinity. And anyway, so whoever made the comment, I think it was Nico. This is why it's important to talk about these things, because we can't do anything until we have talked about it. We can't even think until we talk. Like
you have to have a vocabulary, right?
And you have to have a dialogue in order to actually, like I was talking about this yesterday. What I love about being able to do these kinds of things is I can throw my idea out there and someone can say, that's trash. And I can say, good. Okay. Throw that one in the garbage. Let's move on. Help me with this kind of thing. And we can't do that if we don't talk.
Well, and I think I don't know. I've been thinking about this. I think it's because of Nate's flashback earlier in the broadcast. You ever see the movie Altered States?
Oh, I think a long time ago.
I think maybe, yeah.
And it's about this professor who is experimenting with psychedelics, and he kind of goes into caveman mode.
Oh, I don't know if I've seen that one actually.
William Hurt plays the professor.
Oh, okay.
It was a long time ago. I haven't seen it in years, probably 20 or 30 years. But one of the things that happened is toward the end of the movie, well, through the course of the movie, he and his wife become estranged, and he's having an affair with a student. But he goes through this one trip at the end, which is like the climax of the film, where he comes to realization about how much he loves his wife. And so as soon as he comes down, it's like this beautiful reunion with his wife, which, you can see he's going through this kind of catharsis of the primal, the unregenerated physical, material, the sexual, right? But then he's reunited with his wife, which I think is a beautiful moment. But I think part of what that points to, and we've been talking about Jung a little bit here, and we see this idea with Blake and the emanations and the specters and stuff, is this idea of this kind of psychic, and I mean in the soul, reintegration, right? This is how the book ends, with reintegration of Jerusalem and Albion, and of course, because it's Jerusalem and Albion, it's also Los and Itherman, etc., right? And I think in our own experience, this is what we see. And I think, talking about the integration of the male and the female, or the masculine and the feminine, which was a big deal for Jung and his idea of the Conjunctio, right? Where, and he would point to, you see, and in fact, Marie-Louise von Franz does as well. If you see people who are married, right, they say opposites attract, right? Yeah. So you might have, in our case, right, we have a extroverted male and an introverted female, right? So you kind of, so it's kind of an outward working out of your inner psyche, but I think what we see in our culture right now, especially with the trans thing, you see people trying to integrate their anima or their animus by surgical means, which doesn't work. Which is why they end up depressed and suicidal or whatever, right? It's because you can't do it that way, and it's really sad that our culture it's so materialistic that it thinks you can solve a spiritual disease by physical or material means. Right. And it's not just that; it's other things as well, right?
Okay. So before we sign off here, I just want to say on that note, this is the problem I have with Vervaeke's ecology of practices, right? Because he's trying to solve a spiritual problem by physical means. So if you just go out and do these things, right, you can somehow bring your heaven, align it with your earth, and I don't know. There's something outside of yourself that intersects with you, right? That you don't have control over. Like it happens to you. Right. There's a spiritual thing that happens to you, and so if you're trying to make something happen, I see a flaw in that. I don't think that it's wrong, but I see a flaw in it in the sense that you are no longer receptive. Like you don't have things open up so that something can happen to you. Like the muse, right? Mm-hmm. Where's the muse in the ecology of practices? I don't see that, at least from Vervaeke's point of view.
Well, I think his idea behind the ecology of practices is like he's noticing how like a lot of traditional religions have what you would refer to as an ecology of practices. They don't have. There's not just one. So that he's trying to offer people who, for whatever reason, can't see themselves into one of the traditional faiths. He's trying to offer them enough variety of things to emulate that experience they would get if they were within a tradition that actually has an ecology of practice. That's how I understand.
Right, but then you have to transcend all of them at some point. It's like that what's mind of no mind or something that the Japanese samurai do, where they practice their sword work and their leg work and everything to the nth degree, and then the idea is to forget everything when you go on the battlefield. Right. And there you have a supernatural experience where it comes on you, it possesses you, right? And where does that happen? Like outside of a
what I think all practices what all practices are oriented toward is to getting people to the insight that where he talks about the divinization of all activities, where it's like through your tradition's ecology of practices, you come to be able to see how everything that you do can be performed for
okay
God.
Well for me,
so he literally talks about a ditch digger digging a ditch,
right? Yeah. God. And so I understand that, but I think the easiest way to get there is gratitude. Mm-hmm. Like if you just start practicing gratitude, you're talking to something outside of yourself. Right. Something outside of you is enabling you to live. It's supplying your needs. It's right. You are not able to control your situation. you live in the arms of something that loves you, and for
Right.
that you're grateful, right? And that, to me, that's the easiest way to get there.
But I think the precursor to that is, in my experience, and I think everybody's experience, but we don't notice it, is when we are present,
Right.
and this is when you're present, that's when in what's his name, Terrence Malick's film, the Thin Red Line, right? All things shining. This is where
Right.
where that Sophianic splendor shines through the world, right?
Right.
And I think the response to that is gratitude.
Right.
It's wonder and gratitude and all kinds of other things, right?
Yeah.
And what we're talking about, so with kind of practices like samurai, right? My own experience is, especially in writing poetry and in playing music, especially playing music with other people, because when I was first learning how to be a musician, you're kind of worried about everything. I'm going to play this wrong, or I can practice, and then eventually you get to the point where all of a sudden it becomes play, and the world just opens up, right? And which is, we used to call it mysticism when we'd get to that spot when we play together.
That's what I asked.
Concentration without effort, right?
Right. It's
Tom Berg's first Arcanum.
Well, that's exactly why I asked Rafe Kelly, because we were talking about play and childlikeness, and I said to him, well, how do you see that related to mysticism? And then he got caught up in New Age stuff and trauma from his dad, which is understandable. But I think that's exactly right, Michael. Like, when you get to that place, it is mystical, right? It becomes supernatural. Like, our hair stands up, right? And that's not something we have control over.
No.
It happens to us, right? So, yeah.
And
I think it's and people do try to have this experience and do actually have it.
Yeah.
This goes to Barfield. This goes to Barfield's point that original participation never leaves, right? Because everyone, the most hard-bitten atheist you could possibly find, has had those experiences.
Right.
Has participated in God, unawares.
Yeah, Hitchens called it the numinous, right? He refused to call it anything else.
Right. Yeah.
The numinous. He couldn't deny that it happens. Right.
You can't. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
you can't.
That's what we talked about in the conversation I just recorded with the Bulgakov translators. Somehow we got around to talking about, like, empiricism and the senses, and like my thing is, like, yeah, sure, empiricism, but just pay attention to all the senses. Don't bracket out your spiritual senses. Inspiration, imagination, and intuition are part of how we perceive the world.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right. Do we want to call this a wrap? You got one more thing for us?
Sure.
Let's end with one more quote from Blake.
Okay, good.
What was that? What'd you say, Michael?
Let's end with a quote from Jerusalem.
Okay, let's do that.
Fear not, my sons, this waking death. He has become one with me. Behold him here. We shall not die. We shall be united in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
There we go.
Beautiful.
Oh, perfect.
I really like you, Luke.
Luke's a great guy, yeah.
You aren't calling me though.
Luke's a great guy. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Everyone have a great Saturday.
Yeah.
I'm gonna probably make myself something to eat.
Happy Feast of the Epiphany.
Go Steelers.
It's Epiphany today. I think I just might go scoop some holy water out of my lake, bring it home.
Cool.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.